Are you in the market to buy or sell over-the-road equipment? Do you have tractors or trailers that you'd like to upgrade? Taylor & Martin works with fleets of all sizes, from single-unit owner-operators to large corporate fleets. Working with an auction company that is dedicated to tractors and trailers and only selling them at absolute public auction is the only way to go. Make the conscious decision to work with the best team in the industry, Taylor & Martin Auctioneers.
Welcome to Loaded and Rolling. I'm your host, Thomas Wasson. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about driver recruiting. What's going on with it? What are some of the trends? What do you need to know? And to know that, we're going to be welcoming the folks at Tenstreet. They're going to be talking with us. They had recently released some data and market analysis. It was at their UConnect 25 user conference, and I got a hold of some of it. And we're bringing on their co-founder and CEO, Tim Crawford, to walk us through it and talk about kind of what's going on in the marketplace right now, because there's definitely, if anyone's been keeping up with the freight world, despite conditions being poor and unfavorable, you still need drivers. So it's equally important to figure out how to hire them, how to attract them, and hopefully how to keep them as well. So without further ado, let's welcome Tim. Tim, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to it.
Tell us a little bit about Tenstreet, some of the background as well, and then we'll start diving into this data.
Yeah, we're a software company that work with carriers and drivers to help drivers find jobs and carriers to find their next job, and follow on from that to help drivers get onboarded and kind of manage all the safety and compliance kind of post-hire.
So there's a lot more. Let's walk through, before we talk about the trends, let's walk through the process of getting a driver, because it does seem like putting in the application is just one part of this crazy step of all this documents and everything else that it takes a lot more work than people realize.
It does. Trucking is this really unique combination of velocity and regulation, right? You know, the regulatory hoops that have to be jumped through are monumental, right? Between background checks that the DOT requires, steps that insurance requires, things that the attorneys are telling carriers as a way to defend against nuclear verdicts, those sorts of things are just, there's a lot of I's to dot and T's to cross. But while you're doing that, while carriers are doing that, you've got to be able to move really, really quickly. Even in today's market where freight's down, drivers are being a little pickier, carriers maybe raising their hiring criteria. What we see in the data is minutes absolutely matter, right? The carriers that move more slowly have less discretion in terms of the quality of drivers they can go get. Drivers are still the scarce commodity.
Is there like a half-life? I always wondered about that, because when I managed fleets, drivers would, sometimes they'd browse and put in applications and stuff, but I always wondered if it's like, is it a magic minute, a magic hour, or if I get back to them a day later, has that ship sailed?
Yeah, there's a couple things that are really interesting there. One, what we see is the average driver at least dips a toe in the job market, usually about 3 times a year, about every 4 months we saw on average. Which I think is pretty surprising to a lot of people, but that data has been pretty consistent. Even when, as the economy got weaker, that number really didn't shift, right? So drivers are always on the lookout. Once that driver hits that apply button, right, what we see is that the faster the better. If a carrier responds within 5 minutes, they bump their chances of being able to hire that driver most months by 30 to 40%, right? Within a half hour, you bump your chances 15 to 20%. If you're calling back after 4 hours after, you're below average, right? Your conversion rates are below the platform average by quite a bit. So you can't overemphasize how fast matters.
And talking about that speed, back in the day when I started trucking in 2014, it felt like a lot of it was like phone calls, maybe emails. But now some of the data showed that app-based messaging is the most effective. Talk a little bit about this technology change, because I couldn't imagine a situation where now people are just communicating via the apps instead of the good old fashioned way of a call or a text.
Exactly. Yeah. Um, what we see happening is when carriers and drivers are talking via text, um, the there's so much ambient competition for that driver's attention, right? You're 100 pixels away from the group text with his friends, with the family text, with other non-driving, non-career related things altogether. And so what we see happening is when those interactions happen within the app, you're catching the driver in context, right? He's in that spot of thinking about his job, thinking about his career, and it tends to result in hiring success significantly, like 30-35% higher than just via text. And so one of the things that we feel really strongly about is, hey, make the process easy for a driver. And that's going to get more drivers successfully through that gauntlet that the regulations require.
And if we take too long, I really like this factoid here. When the hiring process is beyond the average of 10 to 15 days, the rates drop by up to 50% for a hiring rate. That's fascinating. So we almost have a world where there are tech savvy carriers that can get back to you within like minutes to hours. And then on the very flip side, there's some that are like 10 to 15 days. Talk a little bit about that. I would not have expected it to be so wild in terms of the large difference, this gulf that exists between response times.
Yeah, and actually, the 10 or 15 days is the whole hiring cycle. Sorry, it's the whole hiring cycle, not sort of just the initial contact. And so kind of what we like to say is, hey, minutes matter, right? That first contact matters, right? But then the whole process matters. And the whole process is more than 10 days, because people are trying to get verifications done. They're trying to get copies of CVLs, right? Whatever the steps are. If that goes longer and longer, drivers tend to look around at people who have a faster overall process. And if you think about it, so what a driver does when they go on the market is they do the totally rational thing from an economics perspective. They're going to look at 2, 3, 4, 5 carriers, right? If all 2, 3, 4, 5 of those carriers have 3 or 4 to-dos, right? Those to-dos for that driver, they're scattered across that driver's life. There's a little bit in his voicemail, a little bit in an email. A couple carriers might be using SMS. Somebody might be using an app. What we see the carriers that win is that make it super easy for that driver to get through the process. Here's what you need to do next. Here's how you go do it. Here's the whole process. And the carriers that say, oh, I sent him a message, I asked him for a copy of a CDL, and it took him 4 days to get back. Well, if that 4 days puts you at 12 days total hiring cycle, most drivers aren't going to stick around for that, even if it's, the ball was in the driver's court for 4 of those days, right? You got to make it easy for drivers, or else they're not going to get, the best drivers aren't going to go through your process.
It reminds me of the early days of e-commerce where everyone wanted the one-click buy, because the problem was if I had to put in my credit card info, I had to put in my address, I had to do all this, I was less likely to buy. So now it's almost like this technology and the speed goal is extended into hiring. And so for the companies who don't even know their process and how it works, you could, if I have 5 companies and I'm like, man, I don't want to deal with this one, I just axed myself out of the whole equation because I didn't have a real streamlined way to remove those barriers.
Oh, exactly. I think what people do is they extrapolate from if this is what the recruiting process is like, what's going to be like to work for this company? And I think that may not be a fair conclusion to draw, but that's the conclusion that people do. It's the only information they have to base it on, and that's absolutely what they use.
And when we're looking at one of the cool quotes you had was not only any delay in the hiring process will reduce the hiring rate, encourage clients to take a moment and experience their own application process. This is something I never thought about before, is try to apply for your own company and see if it makes you mad. Is that something that a lot of folks do, or is it they just kind of preset it up and then they just send it out there without thinking about, like you said, what it tells of the company based on what they're putting out?
We don't think enough folks take advantage of this. And when we say apply for your own company, do it the way a driver's going to do it. Like 88% of applications come in off of a phone. So don't do it from your desktop computer. Do it from your phone. And don't do it from your phone sitting while you're on high-speed Wi-Fi. Go out to some place where you have 3G coverage, right? And see how easy the process is to get through. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we've seen carriers with, they'll link from their advertising to a beautiful picture of some of their equipment, and it's fantastic. But that picture of that truck takes 45 seconds to download over a 3G connection, and it's stuff that never shows up if you're on a big screen in the office. It looks great. What a great experience! It really shows off all the great things we do as a company, and it's just lost on the driver just because of something as simple as, hey, small screen, slow transmission speeds. And I think following it all the way through the hiring process, like, hey, when you ask that driver for a copy of a CDL or proof of insurance if it's an owner operator or what have you, how easy is it for that driver to figure out, okay, where do I go from here? And all those things, what happens over time, regulations are tough, case law is tough, people are making changes to their recruiting process, and they sort of accrete over time. Okay, well, how often do you go back from the beginning and say, hey, let's look at this from square one? It's easy to forget that step. And you're probably driving a bunch of time into the process that's not really managing any risk. It's not really making the process any better. It's just causing problems for candidates needlessly.
And one of the questions I always had, another thing I'd heard in the recruiting space is that the companies aren't doing a good job either describing themselves, explaining what sets them apart. Everyone offers brand new trucks and you can get to go home. But was there anything that you've seen in these general changes? We've seen this move towards more app-based, more technology. Are folks trying to change the way that they're writing it? Because I heard that it can also disqualify if you just put too much or too little about what your company does.
Oh, absolutely. I think drivers are a savvy audience when it comes to promises from trucking companies. And I think the days of, hey, if you put that pay rate in all caps and with a lot of exclamation points, that's really going to signal credibility. I think those days are largely gone, right? If they were ever here, right? And I think communicating in a way that is credible and believable from the driver's perspective is so important because these drivers have so much interaction with carriers that its credibility is really easy to lose from that driver's perspective if you promise too much or it's going to be great. I think the other thing we see that's a misstep is a lot of carriers will spend a lot of time and effort trying to make their outbound messages as slick and as professionally put together as possible. Well, if your outbound message, whether it's an email or a text or what have you, looks like the ad from Target, it's probably not going to get a lot of attention. To the extent it's more personalized, more, hey, this could come from an individual human, hey, the more likely it's going to be to get read and to get acted on. What we see is that the more human connections there are through that recruiting process, the better the conversion rate, right? The more success that gets had. And so that's hard to do at scale. It's hard to do with tough economics. We totally get that. But the more that personal touch shows through, the better the results people have. Because the other piece, and I think this is important, is that the reason most drivers don't go through the hiring process isn't because they're not qualified for the job. They're clearly not qualified drivers applying. But most people that don't go forward with a given carrier, it's not because they're not qualified, it's because they're not interested. And so it's not so much the carrier filtering out the driver. It's what we see in the data. It's clearly the driver filtering out the carrier. And so those touch points are so important to be able to establish, hey, this is why you should invest time with me, driver, or to learn more about my offer. And that degree of authenticity and personal touch signals that in a way that an overly slick message just doesn't.
It reminds me, it's crazy to think I can imagine a conversation where we use online dating analogies, which is you're trying to attract a carrier, you are a driver, and I'm the carrier. I need to have a good profile. I need a good bio. If I'm going to send my first message to this person who liked my driver profile, I need it to be real. Is one of the goals, and I'm going to continue with this analogy. Let's say I've got a driver, they've shown interest, they're doing the first steps, I've sent them my message through the app. Is my next goal to get them on the phone for that kind of personal touch with the recruiter? Or is it actually things are changing where drivers are more okay with having those text messages, but they've got to sound real and not robotic?
Yeah, I think it's going to vary a ton from driver to driver is what we see. Some drivers absolutely want a phone call, but an increasing number, to your point, don't want a phone call because they're getting so many inbound requests from carriers. They would prefer that text message where they're more in control of when that connection happens, and the ability to be asynchronous in time has real value to drivers. And so now, to your point, for some interactions, a more standard, hopefully not quite robotic, but system generated response. Hey, what is my home time? Right? What is the home time policy? What really are the pay packages? Is fine. But the importance of interactions from human to human around making a connection. This is what makes our carrier different. This is why we might be a good place for you. We think that is most effective coming from a human, right? And finding a way to enable that, we think, is really important.
And that kind of ties into some of the data you talked about, enthusiasm and motivated drivers. So when we're looking at year over year comps, some of the data goes back to April. One of the fascinating things was drivers submitted fewer lead applications, but they completed more fuller applications. So as we're seeing these bigger trends where we want to snag them early, it becomes twice as important because the ones that are putting in apps are the most, they're not shopping around as casually anymore. It looks like they really want to make meaningful connections.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And we saw this trend, sort of the drop in lead applications, happen. There's still drivers are still individually on the market with some high degree of regularity, but about the summer of 23, right when the COVID sort of post-COVID hangover really started, drivers got a lot more savvy that the grass probably wasn't greener on the other side of the fence quite as much as maybe that they might have thought beforehand. And so people are being more careful about putting in lead applications, testing the water. But the drivers that are in market are really motivated, and they're more likely to go through and do that full application.
One of the also things I found fascinating was, in addition to submitting more lead applications, there were more full applications to private fleets. And this is what fascinates me because a lot of times when we think of trucking, we think of the for hire space, but there's an entire pipeline that exists, like your Walmarts and Targets of the world with their large private fleets. Tell us some of that dynamic, because my gut tells me that if I'm an over the road driver for hire and I get a few years under my belt, I wouldn't mind a private fleet. Maybe I get a better quality of life. Talk about some of that dynamics.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing, especially in this market where people are prioritizing, stability over other factors more than they have in the past. There's definitely a bit of a movement to safety, right? Safer harbors, meaning smaller fleets are less likely to get new applicants, right? Bigger fleet, people are going to go, hey, look, I'm going to go to a bigger fleet. They're less likely to go out of business than a smaller fleet. Hey, if I can get to a private fleet, they're even less likely to go out of business than a bigger fleet is. And so we're seeing that trend sort of in that direction. And that's been going on really for 18 months or so. Whereas in the past, somebody might be able to say, hey, there's, a couple more cents per mile, or I might, I've gotten on some freight, I can guarantee you more miles per week, those sorts of things. Those promises seem to be less prioritized relative to overall, stability and sort of staying power of those individual companies, right? Private fleets, with at the top of the heap right now, on those characteristics. I think bigger fleets after that, and smaller and medium sized beneath that.
One of the fascinating things here, we got some thunderstorms going on in the background here, if you hear that. But speaking of weather, let's talk about the climate. You all have on the Pulse app, this is fascinating, from 2020 to present. Now you guys are over 1.6 million active users. And so you brought up a really interesting thing, which is when times are rough, we see drivers going to larger fleets. Is there a theory basically we can see if the market starts upswinging when we see the opposite? Well, then drivers are willing to try out these smaller operators. Is there anything that you all see in terms of those changes? I'm assuming like sign-on bonuses, maybe. What are some of kind of these things that when we're looking at changes in drivers that we should look for?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing we're going to be looking for is how long does a driver stay at their current carrier before they go deep into the process with other carriers, right? In a typical down economy, when the economy weakens, drivers look to leave more quickly, right? Hey, I'm going to get on with a fleet that's got more miles. I'm going to get on someplace that I've got more stability. What's happened over the past year or so is that trend has shifted. Hey, drivers are willing to stay longer at fleets than they would have ordinarily in a down economy, right? And so what we're going to start to see is, hey, as the economy gets better, we think we're going to see a lot more driver turnover. We suspect a lot of drivers at fleets that they would have ordinarily left, but they didn't want to be the new driver somewhere else, especially with miles as uncertain as they are right now. And so we're going to be looking to see, hey, what does driver application behavior look like as things start to move? Drivers effectively, when they're applying and they're testing out the job market, they're voting with their feet, and they're making those decisions about voting with their feet based on what they see every day on the road, right? They're talking to other drivers. What are they hearing when they're getting loaded and unloaded, and all those things? They've got a great view as to what's happening in the macro economy from the ground level up. And they take that information, and then that translates into real world, hey, job seeking behavior. And so we're looking for that first, and then the question will be, okay, as that gets better, to your point, hey, what's going to drive? What's the carrier offer that's going to be attractive? And I think it's going to be really simple. I don't know that we see signing bonuses move a ton of the needle a ton, especially for the big group of drivers. What we see is expectations around miles and pay per mile is the big things that people move that seems to attract drivers the most.
I always wondered about that. We talked about in the years leading up to with COVID, and I've been at FreightWaves since 21. There's always the conversation, even when I was at US Express. Do we offer them a bonus? Does the bonus attract the right driver, or do they stick around long enough to where they get most of the bonus and they dip out? Or, as this thing changes, if they're looking for more things. So one of the big things I'm curious to get your thought is, are we moving away from these kind of bonus bidding wars and more of show me the money up front, show me the home time? You got to do a little more than just show me this big old carrot that may take a year to fully vest.
Right. That's a really good question. I don't have who knows what carriers will ultimately end up doing. I think, if you're up against it and hey, I've got a client, I've got trucks on the fence, or I've got freight I need to go move, even if a bonus is bringing in maybe not the most long time perspective drivers, you may be up against it and say, look, hey, I've got to go pull that lever because it's better than having a truck on the fence, right? And so carriers are up against some really tough decisions. My sense is that the bonus will be less of a first tier option, right? But I think it's still going to be in people's bags of tricks of a path they go to. Especially if you think about if this freight recovery, when we eventually get there, looks like others, it's going to be really spotty, right? You're going to see it in bits and pieces. And those things, when they happen, carriers, it's going to be a great problem to have, but it's going to be a problem that carriers have to react to. Okay, hey, we've got some more freight. Hey, we need to go hire some people. and we need it like right now, right? The call comes from operations into the recruiting department. I need X drivers next week. You just got to go do it. And so it doesn't always happen, or doesn't usually happen really smoothly and well planned out. It ends up being just a reaction to the market that everybody's got to get on board with.
Once it happens, it all happens. And then you definitely know. We got a little bit of time left before we wrap things up. Looking ahead, things on your radar. You had some great information about these overall trends between private fleets and for hire, going to safety. What do you kind of keep an eye on the next 6 months to a year from a driver recruiting standpoint that folks maybe need to pay more attention to?
Yeah, I think the thing that we're seeing is, given sort of the financial environment, right? A lot of people are under pressure. Hey, cut your advertising spend by X, right? But that typically doesn't mean, hey, cut your hiring by X, right? It means cut your advertising by 40%, but I only want you to cut your hiring by 30% or 25%, right? And that gap means, hey, carriers have to figure out how to do more with less, right? How do you either, hey, make sure the advertising dollars are more effectively spent, or hey, we're converting a higher percentage than we were before? How do we sort of, the cliche work smarter, not harder, we think is coming up. It's hard to know, hey, when will the freight recovery really be here? When will we back to out of this really, really long cycle? But what we see happening over the next 6 months is, hey, people trying to figure out how do you get more squeeze out of that, or more juice out of that squeeze, responding to those financial pressures.
Perfect. Tim, thank you so much for hopping on. This was some really great information as well. If folks want to learn more about Tenstreet, check out Driver Pulse and this data that you all release about trends. What's the best way to get more info?
I think look us up on tenstreet.com, and we'd love to have a conversation.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tim. We'll definitely have to catch up again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Thomas.
That's going to be a wrap for this episode. But if you're just joining us, we're also on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you may find your podcast needs. Also, check out the folks at Tenstreet. I think it's tenstreet.com. Always amazing stuff. Pay attention to hiring trends because it all comes either upstream or downstream. That's a wrap for this episode. But don't worry, I've got a lot more great stuff coming up. I'll see you again next week.